They did it on a Tuesday, which I always thought was the cruelest part. Not a Friday, when you could at least disappear into a weekend. A Tuesday at 10 in the morning, with every person on my floor already at their desks, coffee cups still warm. Victor Ashland called the meeting. All hands, sales floor, no exceptions. I stood near the back because that's where I usually stood, 14 years of standing near the back, making sure everyone else had a seat first. I remember thinking it was a pipeline review. I had my numbers in my head. My region was up 11%. Owen. Ashland said my name the way you'd read a line item off a spreadsheet. He didn't look up right away. When he did, there was nothing unkind in his face. That was almost the worst part of it. No anger, no personal satisfaction. Just efficiency. You've been with Meridian a long time. 14 years, I said. That's the problem. He said it like he was explaining weather. The company is accelerating, and I need people who accelerate with it. You're a good man, Owen. But at this stage, you're a drag on our future. He paused, and the room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation hum. We're going to have to let you go. I had 30 seconds to feel it, the heat in my face, the very specific silence of 23 people who would not look at me, before HR was beside me with a box and a practiced expression of sympathetic neutrality. They walked me to my desk. They watched me pack my plant, my Yankees mug, the photo of Nate from last summer at the lake. The elevator ride down was 42 seconds. I counted. Nate was home when I pulled into the driveway. He's 11 and he reads faces the way his mother used to, which means he knew before I said a word. Dad. I'm all right. He didn't push. He made us sandwiches without being asked and set them on the counter, and we ate standing up the way we do when neither of us wants to make the meal feel like an occasion. After a while he said, quietly, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to figure it out," I told him. "That's what we do." He nodded like that was enough. 11 years old, and he trusted that completely. I went to bed that night telling myself I deserved that trust. I wasn't sure I believed it. I didn't sleep much. At 2 in the morning I went to my father's study, the small room off the hallway that I'd barely touched in the 3 years since he died. His desk was still there, the old walnut one with the brass hardware he'd brought from the office when he retired. I sat down in his chair and looked at his bookshelves, and for a long time I just sat there with the lamp on low, letting the room be quiet. My father, Robert Cassidy, had a rule he said so often it stopped landing: don't tell people who you are. Show them, and then let it go. He said a man who has to announce his worth has already lost half of it. What I hadn't told anyone, what my father had specifically asked me not to make a point of, was that he'd helped start Meridian Group. Not as an employee. As a co-founder. He and Gerald Marsh had built it from a 2-room office in 1987 with a shared telephone and a client list that fit on a single sheet of paper. When Gerald brought in outside investors and the company grew into something neither of them had exactly planned, my father took his equity stake and stepped back. He didn't want to run it. He wanted to build things with his hands and raise me right. So he held his 40%, let Gerald run it, and never once mentioned it to me until the year before he died. The stake passed to me when he went. Quietly, through the estate. I had a call with the company's founding attorney the week after the funeral, and I remember sitting in that same study looking at documents I didn't fully understand yet, and asking him what all of it meant. He told me I was now the single largest individual shareholder of Meridian Group. I was already an employee. I had no idea what to do with that, and my father had been very clear: don't let it change how you show up. Work your region. Be useful. The rest is just paper. So I did. For 3 years I worked my region and filed the ownership paperwork away in the bottom drawer of that walnut desk, and I showed up to every team meeting and stood near the back, and I let Victor Ashland, who had been hired 18 months ago by a board that didn't fully understand what was in the founding documents, call me a drag on the company's future. The night after they walked me out, I opened the bottom drawer. The next 30 days were quiet ones. I called Marcus Webb, who had been my father's attorney and was now mine. He was a deliberate man who spoke in short sentences and never used a word that could be shorter. He reviewed everything, called the 2 surviving original board members, Gerald's widow, Pauline, and a man named Arthur Hines who had been silent for a decade but had not forgotten, and within 10 days the picture was clear. My 40%, combined with Pauline's 18 and Arthur's 9, represented controlling interest. Ashland's restructuring had proceeded without ever consulting the founding shareholder agreement. Marcus used the phrase, procedural irregularity, several times. I told him I didn't want to burn the building down. He paused. Then what do you want? I had thought about it for days. I'd walked Nate to school and thought about it. I'd sat with my father's old chair turned toward the window and thought about it. Ashland wasn't a bad man. The people who'd stood in that sales meeting and watched without saying a word weren't bad people. They were people doing what people do when the room goes quiet and the pressure comes from above. They kept their heads down. I had done the same thing enough times to know. What I wanted was not what I'd expected to want. I didn't want Ashland's job. I didn't want to go back to that floor and collect anyone's apology. I wanted one thing, and when I told Marcus, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, in his dry, short way, your father would have done the same. I had one condition. Marcus arranged the meeting for a Thursday. He sent the notice to the board and to Ashland's office, and he listed me on the agenda as, R. Cassidy Estate, Shareholder Matters. Ashland's assistant called my cell phone that evening, confused. I didn't return the call. I wore my father's tie. Navy with a small silver stripe. He'd worn it to every important meeting he ever walked into, and he'd told me once that the point of a good tie was not to impress anyone but to remind yourself to stand up straight. The 14th floor of Meridian Group looks the same as it always had. The long hallway, the glass boardroom at the end, the framed company history on the wall outside, a photograph from 1987 of two young men in a small office with a shared telephone. My father is on the left. He's grinning. He looks about 30 years younger than the men in the walnut study, and he looks exactly like Nate. I stood in front of that photograph for a moment. Then I walked into the boardroom. Ashland was already seated. Pauline Marsh was across from him, hands folded. Arthur Hines was at the far end. Two members of the current board sat on Ashland's right, looking at papers they didn't seem to fully understand. When I walked in, Ashland looked up and his face went through something, recognition, confusion, the beginning of irritation. Owen. He said my name the same way as before. Then he looked at Marcus, who had come in behind me and set a leather portfolio on the table, and the irritation shifted to something else. Marcus introduced me. Not as Owen Cassidy, former regional sales manager. As Owen Cassidy, holder of 40% of Meridian Group's founding equity, primary shareholder, standing before the board under the terms of the 1987 founding agreement. He put the documents on the table. He let the room read them. Ashland read slowly. I watched him. There was no pleasure in it for me, which surprised me a little. I had thought there might be. But what I felt, sitting in that boardroom in my father's tie, was something closer to tired. Not from this moment, from all the moments that lead to moments like this. From the weight of things people carry when they decide that other people don't matter. I don't understand, Ashland said. He looked up at me. My father co-founded this company, I said. He worked quietly and he let other people take the credit and he never made a point of what he was owed. I worked here for 14 years the same way. Last month you told me I was a drag on your future. I paused. I've thought about that a great deal. The room was the same kind of quiet the sales floor had been. The ventilation hum, the distant sound of the building. I could restructure this board, I said. I have the votes to do it. I could remove you, Victor, and install whoever Marcus recommends, and by the end of next quarter nobody would remember your name in this building. That's what the documents give me the right to do. Ashland sat very still. But I'm not going to do that. The silence in the room changed. Pauline Marsh looked at me steadily. Arthur Hines had not moved. You fired me in front of 23 people, I said. Some of them have worked alongside me for a decade. Some of them are good people who kept their heads down because that's what you do when the room goes quiet and the pressure comes from above. I know what that's like. I'm not angry at them. I looked at Ashland directly. I'm not angry at you. He opened his mouth and closed it. My father had one rule, I said. He said a man's worth isn't what he takes when he has the power. It's what he gives. I'm not here to collect. I'm here because this company is still something he and Gerald Marsh built with their hands, and I believe it can be something worth keeping, if the people running it remember what it was built on. I told them my one condition. The Cassidy Fund. Named for my father, Robert Cassidy, co-founder. A dedicated hardship reserve for Meridian employees, anyone facing a medical crisis, a family emergency, a sudden loss. Fully funded from a portion of the founding equity's annual distribution, administered by a small committee that included one employee representative elected by the floor. Not a charity. A foundation. Built into the company's structure the way my father's work had been built into its walls, quietly, without announcement. Ashland agreed. He didn't have much of a choice, but I will tell you this, when he nodded, it didn't look like a man accepting terms. It looked like a man who had just been shown something he hadn't known he was missing. The photograph in the hallway, I said, as Marcus gathered the portfolio. My father is in it. He's been there the whole time. I'd appreciate it if his name was added to the caption. That was all I asked. I shook hands with Pauline Marsh, who held mine for a moment and said, quietly, Robert would be proud. I shook hands with Arthur Hines, who said nothing at all but looked at me in a way that said everything. I shook hands with Victor Ashland last. He said he was sorry. I told him I believed him. I meant it. I stopped in the hallway on the way out and looked at the photograph again. My father, 30 years younger, grinning in a small office with a shared telephone. I stood there long enough to feel it properly, the weight of what he'd built and the lightness of what he'd let go. He could have told me who he was at any time. He chose to show me instead, and then he left it to me to figure out the rest. I drove home. Nate was in the kitchen doing homework, his sneakers kicked off at the back door the way they always are. He looked up. How'd it go? I hung my jacket on the hook. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Good, I said. I think it went good. He watched me for a second with those reading faces eyes of his. Did you do the right thing? I think so. Grandpa would say you only get to decide that later. He turned back to his homework. Then, without looking up, I think you did. I stayed at the table while he finished his work. The kitchen light was warm and the house was quiet the way it gets when you've stopped waiting for something to happen. I thought about the photograph in the hallway, my father's grin, the small office, the shared telephone, and I thought about how a man can build something with his hands for decades and leave the most important part of it where you'll only find it when you need it most. The most powerful thing I've ever done in my life was walk into that boardroom and put my name on a piece of paper that said I forgave them. The second most powerful thing was driving home and sitting at the kitchen table with my son. Some things, my father used to say, you can only show a person. You can't explain them. You just have to do them, and let the room go still, and trust that what you gave was worth more than what you could have taken. He was right. He usually was.